Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. We want to talk about FileTrain again. We've done a couple of other webinars, an introductory one, and then one about managing FileTrain and techniques to keep your installation of FileTrain and all the flows that you have in there manageable. This is the third and final one in that series, and it will talk about a number of more advanced FileTrain techniques. So this webinar will, I think, take about an hour. Okay, let's get started with this. This webinar, as I said, is about FileTrain, and it's about more advanced stuff in FileTrain. And I have a short presentation that is more for your reference than anything else, to be honest. I will be doing demos for most of the time anyway. But you can see the kind of things that I want to be covering. Talking about XML files, talking about database access, implementing loops inside of FileTrain, which is a very neat concept, but it can also be a little bit confusing, and talking about running command line tools. Now, before we go there, I'm actually going to base the examples in this webinar on two stations, on two automated workflows that I made. They're not production workflows, but they are, in both cases, demo workflows if you want. And I've included two screenshots of those in here, but I'm actually going to show them to you in practice, or show the result of them to begin with. What I have here is a very simple local website. If you're interested in the technical details, I'm actually running MAMP Pro on my Mac to provide me with a local web server and a database. And this website is using that local web server and database to provide me with demo capabilities. I have a topic here called preflight analysis, and I have another topic called contact database. And actually, those are driven by FileTrain workflows, or at least allow me to show what a FileTrain workflow can do. In the first case, I have created a little website that shows me which files were preflighted, and then shows me preflight analysis or statistics for those files. What you see here is an overview of the actual files. You see the number of pages in each file, the number of errors, warning, and fixes that were encountered during preflight, and a very simple to read thumbs down or thumbs up to show whether preflight was successful or not. That's determined by the number of errors that you see here. And then I have a details link that shows me all of the preflight hits, so errors and warnings, and shows me which preflight fixes were done to these documents as well. So this is a site that, to put it very briefly or shortly, shows me information on each file that has been preflighted. And I can go back to home here, and I could draw a list of fix-ups, for example. These are all the fixes that were done to at least one of those files. And for example, there is one here called discard all actions, including JavaScript actions. Well, that will tell me that there is a file called webinar test that was processed and that had needed this action to be executed as part of the preflight. So this first thing here does preflight statistics, and in the background there is a FileTrain station that does all of the actual hard work. So if I go back to FileTrain for a second, and we take a look at station number 6, which is called process callas preflight results, then this does the actual preflight that I'm interested in, and then it does a processing of the XML preflight reports generated by pdfToolbox. And all of that information is stored in the database, and it is that database that is used in this little web application to show me preflight statistics. So in this case, the station here and the website cooperate if you want. The station does the automatic preflight and stores everything in the database, and the website reads from the database and shows me the information that was stored in there. So this is one of the stations that we will be looking at in the remainder of the webinar. Now, before we do that, let me show you this second example called contact database. This is a little bit different. I can show you here using a website what the principles are, but then I will have a station in FileTrain that does almost the same thing in a little bit different way, but almost the same thing, and that is this one here, number 11, called Create Business Cards with PDF Chip. And let me show you first what it does. What I have here is a very large database with companies, phone number, email addresses. Don't worry about the names that you see in here. This is demo data that I got from a website that can create these dummy records for you. And it's a very long list. I can show you by going to, let's say, 50,000. And so this shows me the record starting with number 50,000. So I have a very long list of records. But then there is a button here that says Create PDF. And if I click that, you'll see some stuff happen. And what will show up is a PDF document. And it is a PDF document. I can download it here. And then I could open it up. It's called Business Cards. It's actually a good PDF file. So if I drag this on top of pdfToolbox, it will open up and show up as a PDFX1A with an output intent in there. I have separation colors in here. You can see that by looking at the individual separations, and it will show me that there is a spot color in here called callas red that is used for the text of this business card. So what happened here is that I selected a number of records in the on the website. So I selected a particular range of information from the database that, again, runs behind this website. And then by clicking this button, a tool called callas PDF Chip, and that requires some more explanation, but I'll get to that when I look at the station. A tool called PDF Chip was launched, and that tool took all of this information and, using a template, converted it into a PDF file that contains 1 page per business card. So variable data if you want, in a fairly simple way. So those are the two examples that I built that I will be using to look at these advanced techniques inside of FileTrain. Let me go back to the presentation for a second, and we'll see what is first. So first of all, in many cases, what you want to do is get information out of XML files, and FileTrain built in, you know that everything is built into FileTrain. It doesn't come with options or modules. It's a simple package where everything is included in the application. And FileTrain has a number of tools to work with XML files. If you joined the webinar I did last week, you will remember two important concepts that we talked about. One was buckets, which was a place to store information, and the other one was macros. And these macros are the things that you see here, something that starts and ends with a percentage sign. And the macro is actually replaced by FileTrain when it runs files through a station. There are two macros that are important when we're talking about XML files. The first one is called file content, and file content is actually replaced by FileTrain. What it replaces this macro with is the content of the actual file that you're processing. So if I have a station that processes an XML file, then this macro will contain the actual content, textual content of that XML file. That is one that you'll see in a second. And then the second one is this XPath macro. And the XPath macro is used to examine an XML file and get content out of it. Now, let me make that a little bit more clear. And what I need for that is this create business cards with PDF chip example station, I need you to look at the folder structure I have for that as well. Let me arrange this a little bit so that we can see everything on screen. What I have here is station 11, and that is the station that creates business cards, just as what you saw me do on the website, but this is an example with where FileTrain does the actual work. And I have a folder structure to work with that. Now, before I go there, I need to explain what the process is here. And what the station does is it accepts an XML file, and that XML file contains the actual work to be done. And you can see my folder here called order XML. Well, that has an XML file in it. And if I show you what is in there, you can see that it's a very, very simple XML file that just has one element, the root element called order, and then it has an element called start and an element called end. And of course, the start element details the index in the database of the first business card that we want to produce, and the element called end is the last business card. So in this case, we want to generate 100, actually 101, I believe, business cards in a PDF document. What the station will do is it will look at the source folder called input. So what I can do here is put that input, that XML file into the input folder, and then the station will pick those up, and it has a first action that says parse order XML. Now this is a bucket action, and again, remember what we talked about last week when we talked about FileTrain and buckets and macros. Well, that bucket was a place to store information. This is an object bucket, so this one will actually store information for this order XML that we're processing. So that is information that will travel with that XML file as it is moved from action to action, as it goes through the automated workflow in FileTrain. And what this bucket action does is precisely storing information in a bucket. And I have two buckets that I'm filling. One is called order start. The other one is called order end. What I put in there is the result of this double macro that I have. In here, you can see the macro file content. As I said, this will be replaced with the content of that XML file. So that is this text that we looked at. And then the outer macro here is an XPath macro. And this XPath macro tells FileTrain to examine the XML in here, so the XML that actually was read from the XML file, and then to run this XPath instruction on this. And you can see that this is order and start. Now, if you're not familiar with XPath instructions, let me go back to the presentation for a second. That's a standard way to get information out of XML. There is a documentation link that I put in here, but there is actually one that is perhaps even more interesting, and that is one where you can test out the result of these XPath instructions. So if I go to that, it's called XPath Tester. It gives me a way to enter my XML. So let me open this up in something. So take this XML, it lets me enter the XML in the website. There we go. And then after that, I can test the XPath that I want. And in my case, I typed order start. And if we run this, it shows you that the XPath instruction returns one item, and that item is actually this one here. Now, if I do this in FileTrain, I'll get the same result. So what will be entered in here is actually the value of that one element that I select. And that value in this case is the value that I had in that XML file. So in my example, it will be 10,000. And the same for end. So this first action, as you see it here, creates two buckets for me that are connected to the XML file itself. It stores the beginning of the range that I want in that first bucket, and it stores the end of that range in the second bucket that I have here. Now, in order to make sure that we're doing the right thing, I inserted a debug action. And again, that goes back to a technique we talked about last week, where I write out a text file, in this case to the debug folder, and in that text file, I write the values of those two buckets that I just filled. And this is just to make sure that whatever FileTrain read out of the XML is actually what I think it would have read out there. So once you're using this workflow in production, I would simply remove this action because it's a debug action, a testing action. And then it does the rest of the stuff it needs to be doing. Now, this is a simple example of that XML parsing, because what I do here is create a simple XML file and use that as input to the station. In order to show you that it doesn't have to be that simple by itself, let me go back to the other station. So this is the example where we do preflight analysis. And you can see that in this case, there are two input sources. There is one called input, there is one called reports XML. And actually, one will feed into the other. If I put a PDF file into the input source here, that PDF file will be picked up by the filter for PDF documents. That filter will then issue a first action, which is process files with magazine ads, that uses pdfToolbox to preflight a file. And that preflight generates an XML report. That XML report is stored into this folder, reports XML, and that folder is a source by itself. So that XML report will be picked up, and it's picked up by a filter on XML files. And then again, in here, we have one of those bucket actions that processes those XML reports. You can see the same structure, two buckets in here as well. I have a macro called XPath, and then a macro called file content. So I'm again looking at the content of that XML file that I'm processing, in this case, an XML report from pdfToolbox. But you can see that the rest of this macro is slightly more complex. And the reason for that is that the XML report that comes out of pdfToolbox is a much more complex XML file than the one I created here in my example as an order XML. And one thing that makes it more complex is the fact that the XML report uses default namespaces. And in order to work with a default namespace, you need to connect a prefix that you come up with to the actual namespace URL that is used in that XML file. So that's what happens here. And then the rest of my XPath instruction here looks for information in that XML file, and you can see this PI4 prefix showing up. That is that same one that I associated with that URL. So again, this has to do with the fact that there are these default namespaces in that XML report. But the rest is fairly simple. I'm looking at an element called document, and in that document element, I'm looking for an element called document info. And in that doc info element, I'm looking for an element called file name. And the content of that file name element is what gets stored in the bucket. The same for the second one, same structure because I'm reading the same report. But in this one, goes up to here. The XPath instruction, the actual XPath instruction is count page. So count the number of page elements you encounter in that XML report. And because I know how the structure of the XML report is, I know that this count instruction gives me the number of pages in that in the file that was preflighted, and that then gets stored inside of the bucket. So it looks a little bit more complex, but the system is actually exactly the same. I'm using file content to get access to the XML file itself, and I'm using the XPath macro to get access to the element that I'm interested in, whether it's the file name or the number of pages or any other XPath instruction you care to write. The system is exactly the same. So again, if you haven't used XPath before or you don't know what it is, then refer to this documentation. There is actually a lot of documentation that you can find on the internet. There are a lot of good books about it as well. And either use this or a similar XPath tester website to see whether you are doing the right thing. If you're writing an XPath instruction, of course you can use these debug actions in FileTrain, but this website is actually a fairly fast way to figure out whether your XPath is correct. And once you get the correct results there, I would use then a debug action in FileTrain to make sure that you get the right stuff out of FileTrain as well. But start by testing your XPath instruction in this website or a similar one, or an application that can test that. There are applications that can work with XML and XPath as well, if you want to go that route. So that's the first thing I wanted to talk about, is basically XPath and XML possibilities inside of FileTrain. And you already saw that this was leading up to the second point, and that's database access. In both cases, I'm getting information out of an XML file, and both of these stations then actually have the need to do something with that information. In the preflight statistics example, I want to store information inside a database. In the example that I have for PDF chip and business cards, I actually want to read information out of the database. And how do you do that? Well, let me go back to this action and let me show you this one here. It's an action that is called register file with database. And if I open it up, you can see it's a database action. And a database action has two important parts. It has a connection part and it has a database call part. Of course, the connection details where the database is that you want to do something with. And then the database call bit is the actual thing that you want to do with that database. When you look at the connection part, you can see that FileTrain knows how to connect to a number of databases. Oracle, MySQL, which is what I'm using here, FileMaker, or SQL Server. What it needs is the address of the database. Now, I told you that I'm using this MAMP application. That means that in my example, the database is local. 127.0.0.1 is the IP address of my local machine. That's a way to specify the local machine in using an IP address. And my MAMP application allows me to set up specific ports for databases as well. And I've done that here to in MAMP. So I need to use the correct port to connect to that database here as well. Then in my database, there are a number of different database names. I have different tables in there and databases in there. And the database I'm working with here is called FileTrain. So I specify that as well. And then it's a regular login. I'm doing something that is not at all very secure, but it's my local machine, so it's not really a problem. I'm using root, and then I have my password in here. And I can click this button to test whether that connection actually works. And it tells me that it does, which is good. So this is the connection that you set up to the database, and whether this database is running here on a different machine, or it doesn't matter. The only thing you need is the connection information here to connect to it. And then I have the database call that I want to do. And there are three different possibilities here. You can use stored procedures or stored functions, which is basically code that resides in the database. And all I do here is specify what the name is of that function that I want to use. And then I can also, so procedure or function, or I can use SQL or SQL, and that is actual SQL code. If you've ever seen these select from statements, then this is the kind of SQL code that you can enter in this SQL area in here. In my case, I haven't done that. I have specified in this example a stored function. This is the name of the function. It expects to get two pieces of information. First of all, the file name, and second of all, the page count. And remember that those two things were actually the things that we got from that XML report earlier on. So bucket and then this name gets the information out of that bucket where we stored it, and then it sends it to the database. And then we also have a return value from the database. In this case, it's the unique ID with which this information about a new file that was preflighted is stored in the database. So this comes back, and this action that you have here stores the information inside of the bucket with the name that I specify here. So you can see already that, yes, I can read and write to the database, but I can actually combine that. I have a function here that gives some information to the database, and that information will be stored in there. But as part of that process, the database will create a unique ID, and I am actually reading that unique ID back to FileTrain so that I can use it afterwards. And the way to do that, of course, again, is use that bucket system and storing that unique ID in a bucket in FileTrain. Now, this is, again, already a fairly complex one because I want to store information in there and get something back and so on. If we go back to the other example with the business cards and PDF chip, then I also have an action here that deals with the database. Remember that here we had our order XML. I read the information out of that order XML, and then we want to get the correct information out of our database. So again, this is a database action. I am actually connecting to the same database server running on my local machine, but I am accessing a different database in this case called contact information. And then when I go to database call, in this example, I'm not using a procedure or a function. I'm actually simply using SQL code, and you can see what happens here. Select, and then I get some information out of there. And it comes out of a database table called contacts, and I have a limit statement here that uses the order start bucket and the order end bucket to determine how much of these, which records will be read and how many records will be read from this database table. And you might wonder, well, I'm reading something now. You might wonder where that information is going. Well, this is a little bit of a special case because you'll end up with a number of different rows. Each row contains the information for one business card. You end up with a number of different rows of information from the database. And instead of specifying a bucket key in here, you'll see that FileTrain has a special bucket that it puts that stuff in automatically. And if I look at the next action, you'll see this one here called bucket list. And this is a macro in here that uses something called contact row list. And this is the bucket that was created automatically by FileTrain. But we're taking a little bit of a leap here because what I showed you is a ForEach action, and that is actually the next point I wanted to talk about. And that is the capability of implementing a loop inside of FileTrain. If you watched the webinar last week, you will have seen that there is also a possibility to do something that for a developer will typically be called if then else. There is a macro called case that allows you to implement these kinds of if condition is true, do this. If the condition is not true, do something else logic. So that's a macro called case. Well, there is also the possibility in FileTrain to do loops, another very common development paradigm. That is not done with a macro, but it's done with an action. And that action is called ForEach. And that action is typically used to process the result of a database call or process the result of an XPath query out of an XML file. And the reason for that is fairly obvious. If I query a database, I could get back one single answer, but in many cases, I'll probably get back a list of information from that database. So to do something useful with it, I have to be able to iterate over that list. And the same goes for an XPath query. You've seen two examples before where the XPath query simply gave me a single answer, the file name, the order start, order end, the number of pages. But it's very easy to imagine that an XPath query will not simply return a value, but it will return a list. And that list, again, you need to be able to iterate to do something useful. And again, the ForEach action is the most logical way to do this. So let's look at that again. If I open this up, then I have a name, of course, in this action, and then I have a value and I have a delimiter. And that is sometimes a little bit confusing if you want. And the reason it's confusing is because it's not exactly clear what that value should be. Well, in our case, in this case, the value is a bucket list of contact row list. And what that does is it gets the information out of the bucket called contact row lists. I'll remind you that it was put in there by our database action. You can see here select, and you can see here as contact row. Well, because this is called contact row, FileTrain automatically builds a bucket called contact row hyphen list with the results of that call. And all I'm doing here is preparing those, if you want, combining them with a special delimiter. And then the next field identifies that delimiter to the ForEach action. The result of these two things is that the ForEach action will take whatever comes out of the database, split it up into single rows in our case, each row containing information for one business card, and then it will store that information in something called a bucket called contact row. And then it iterates these actions that you see here. I only have one in this example, but it iterates all the actions that you add here for each element in that list. Once more, we have a database call. The database call gives me 100 different business card records. These two together make sure that the ForEach action understands that there are, in fact, 100 pieces of information. It will take one piece of information, put that in the bucket called contact row, and run all of the actions in here. Then it takes the second piece of information, puts that in the bucket, same bucket, runs these actions, third piece of information, and so on, until the whole list has been processed. So all you really need to know once this action has been set up is that there are a number of actions that will be repeated, and while you're repeating these actions, you can use the bucket called contact row to do something. And if I double click on that action, that is exactly what happens. I have a text output action that says write out the content of contact row and write out a line ending character. This is a macro that gives me character number 10, which happens to be a line ending. I always forget whether it's carriage return or line feed. I think it's line feed, the 10, but that gives you that character basically. And this is set to append. So each time you loop through this, the current value of contact row will be written to that text file. And because it's set to append, it's going to be appended to it. So at the end of this loop, this text file will contain 100 lines each line having the information for one business card in it. So this is how it looks when we're doing a database call, but I actually, in my other example, have the same thing going on for an XML file. So if we look at this, this is virtually the same, but you can see that this one uses bucket list, and then it uses something called callas XML hits. Now, where does that come from? It doesn't come out of a database. It actually comes out of, so this is store here. This is the one that I want. This looks very similar to what we've looked at before. It has this file content to represent the actual XML file that we want to be working with. But then instead of an XPath macro, it has XPath list element. And that is a special macro that will run an XPath instruction, but that will give me a list of all of the elements found by that XPath instruction. Why would we do that here? Well, we're processing a callas preflight report in this example. That callas preflight report contains a list of hits. Each hit is an error, a warning, or an informational item. Well, this gives me this little XPath instruction here, gives me a list of all of the hits in that XML file. So it actually gives me, if there are 10 preflight errors, it will give me 10 XML elements, and it stores those elements inside of a bucket. And again, the bucket name is not specified where you would expect it to be. It is actually specified inside of the macro itself. If you go look up the documentation for the macro, you'll see that that is the case. That is the extra element that I have in this macro definition. It's called callas XML hits. And if we look at our ForEach action, and for this example, it actually refers to that same callas XML hits. So this gives me a list of stuff, and the ForEach action again uses that list and uses the special macro bucket list with a custom delimiter and a custom delimiter here, and the rest is exactly similar. This will tell the ForEach action that there is a list of elements that need to be processed. In this case, it's not database results, it's actually XML elements. Each time through the loop, there is this bucket called callas XML hits object that will be filled with that XML element that we found, and then these three actions are run on that XML element. And then FileTrain will store the next XML element in the bucket, and it runs these actions again. So again, it's a loop over each of the elements that you have in that list. Let me go back to my presentation for a second here. There is only one last bit that I want to use these examples for to highlight, and that is actually the capability to run command line tools. I didn't have to do this for pdfToolbox because pdfToolbox actually has an action in FileTrain. So if I very quickly go back here and we look at this first action, you can see that this is a callas pdfToolbox processing action. That means that I can simply use the built-in user interface here to set up what I want, where I want my reports, where I want the result files, and so on. That is, of course, not the case for all applications. And in many cases, you'll have an application that is not known to FileTrain, so you don't have a built-in action for it, but you still want to run it. And I have an example here. I have in here, and I'm not sure I put it in there, or let me see actually where I put that. So if we look at the FileTrain action here, I have an application stored under term and then PDF chip. So PDF chip here. This is a command line application. It's a very new application. It's not even officially released yet. It will be released in January. And it's an application that has the capability to take an HTML template and to convert that HTML template into a good PDF file. And because it's a very new application, obviously FileTrain doesn't have a built-in action for it, but I still want to run it. And because it's a command line application, that's fairly easy. Let me see if I can get the full command line on here. That will be a little bit difficult. Yes. So the command line that you have here or what you have to do in this command line action in FileTrain is actually two things. First of all, you need to specify the command that you want to run. And in my case, this is an application. It's this PDF chip application that I specified. So that's the tool that you want to run. And that could be an application that supports command line. It could also be a shell script or anything that you can call from a terminal window, basically. And then I have the parameters that I want to pass to that application. Now, this requires a little bit of explanation. You can see it already here. The parameters should be separated with commas. And that can be a little bit confusing in the beginning. The things that you specify in here will be passed to the application that you specify here. But before they are passed, they are pre-processed, if you want. And the reason that they're pre-processed mainly has to do with the fact that, look at the background of this edit field. It's a yellow background. So you can have macros in here as well. And these macros, of course, have to be substituted by FileTrain before the actual parameter is passed to the command line tool that you want to run. And part of that process is that each thing that is separated with a comma here is looked at by FileTrain as a separate command line parameter. And it will be taken out. It's examined for macros. The macros are substituted, and then it will be put on a command line. There will be a space following it, and then you'll have the next parameter. So everything that you specify here needs to be separated by commas. And if I needed to specify something additional, this will be very familiar if you're already looked at a pdfToolbox command line. It had things like, let's say, no optimization. Well, the normal command line parameter for that in the tool would be ---- no optimization. The only thing I have to do here is make sure that there is a comma with to separate it from anything else that I put in this box. If I have spaces in here, then I need to put them in between these separators, of course, just as I would do in a normal command line. So I'm using double quotes in this case to delimit these because the path actually does contain spaces in multiple locations in here. So all that this will do is run a command line command that I specify, so an application that I specify, and then it passes information to there. Now keep in mind that this application, this PDF chip application, doesn't know anything about FileTrain at that point in time. So if I want to specify where the output is to be generated out of a PDF chip, then I need to specify that using a command line parameter. And actually, that's exactly what happens here. I have a first command line parameter that specifies where the template is that I want to use. Then I have a second one that specifies where the output result should be. And then the rest of this FileTrain station is concerned with delivering the results. Let's see if we can make this work in a meaningful way. So if I take this, I put actually the order XML inside my input source. Let's see if I say start station, whether it will actually do something. And what it should do in this case is it should pick up the XML file. It generates this text file with debug information that shows me that my XPath instruction correctly extracted 10,000 and 10,100 as a start and end of what I want to do here. The XML will be put in the processed XML, and then I have a file with the business card information in here. So these are all of the business cards that were generated by PDF chip, controlled by the order XML to determine what the start and the end business card is that will be generated in this particular order. The information for the business cards comes out of the database, as you've seen, and then the conversion from data to a good PDF file is done by using this HTML template, which has a number of specific additions to make sure that it becomes proper PDF once it has been converted with PDF chip, and then the converted business card ends up in the business card.pdf file. So that's the full example of what was going on here. If we go back to the other one, so if I go back to station number 6, I already have a bunch of stuff in here, but what we can do is this is the input folder that we want, so I'm just going to pick up some PDF files and drop them in there. And if we now launch this station, what will happen here is that the PDF files will be picked up from the input folder. The first step that will take place is a preflight, so the files will be preflighted with the profile that I've specified, and they will be put either in bad PDF files or good PDF files. Then the originals are moved to the output folder, and the most important part is that there will be a report generated in here. And those reports are what is being parsed by FileTrain afterwards. So if I open one of these up, here we go, you can see that, as I said, this XML file is much more complex. It's actually a fairly long XML file if you run through it. You can also see this little thing here, which is the namespace, the default namespace for this report, and that's why we needed to have some extra information in that XPath instruction that we had there. This XML is picked up and it's being processed, and you can see that some of these XMLs already arrived in the meantime. So the flow is actually doing its work. All of the XML files have been generated, and then these XML files will now be stored in the database with those FileTrain actions in there. So let me go back to my presentation for a second and review what we've looked at. First of all, we've looked at the fact that you can get information out of XML files quite easily. There is an XPath macro. There is a little bit more complex XPath list element macro. Those can be used to examine an XML file and get whatever information you need out of that XML file into buckets. That's the first thing that we've seen here. The second piece that we've looked at was the capability of storing information inside databases and getting it outside of databases. And both of those are done with the database action that can connect to MySQL database server, or is a SQL server, or an Oracle, or there's one that I'm missing now. So a number of different FileMaker, that's what I was looking for. So a number of different database types, and it can either use simple SQL code, or it can use stored procedures and functions. You can read information out of a database. You can store information in a database, depending on the type of application that you're trying to automate. In both cases, it's crucially important that FileTrain allows you to implement loops. Because if you read stuff from a database, very frequently you're going to end up with multiple pieces of information, and you want to be able to iterate across those pieces of information. Same thing with XML files. If I read information out of XML, the most simple applications, I'll get a simple value back, and that's fine. But in many cases, I'll get a list of elements back, and I need to be able to iterate over that list of elements and then do something to all of these elements in there. And then the last bit in there is the ability to run command line tools. And we've seen that illustrated with pdfChip, the new application from Callas that can convert an HTML template into a PDF file. But basically, you can run any command line tool that you have with this technique, either simply running the application by itself or creating a bat file or a command file on Windows or a shell script on Mac and running those. Both techniques are actually possible. And we've seen cases where people will write, for example, a Python script and run that Python script, or another script that can be run on Mac or Windows, and they use the command line action here to start that script and have it do whatever it needs to do. And if you put all of that together, you can build fairly complex automated workflows, as you've seen. The one example that I showed with the preflight statistics, and then the second example where we looked at generating business cards. In both cases, we're looking at something that is fairly complex, but that is very easy to implement with FileTrain. Remember again, and that's the last thing I want to say, if you have any questions, now would be a good time to enter them in the questions box so I can get them answered. But the last point I wanted to make was, let me repeat that FileTrain doesn't come with options or any of those things. It simply has, it's an application, and all of the functionalities that I've shown here are simply included in that application, and you are free to use any of them in your automated workflows. I see I have one question on slides and stuff. Yes, we will certainly do that. I'll send them out to you separately, Stefan, but we'll post both the slides of this presentation and the recording of the webinar on the website. And because all of you are registered for this webinar, you'll get an email with the link to that recording and the presentation in there as well. And of course, if you run into any questions about any of these functionalities, or you want help to build some of these more complex workflows, that's why we're here for. Don't hesitate to send us a little question. You can reach us at info@4ps.com or support@4ps.com, or simply use my email address. That's also a possibility. And that actually concludes what I wanted to say about FileTrain in this webinar, and it also concludes, and exactly on time as well, I might add, it also concludes the last webinar for 2014. I've seen many of you in multiple of my webinars throughout the year. Thank you for that. I hope it was interesting. I guess it was, or you wouldn't keep coming back for more. There will be just as interesting webinars in 2015. If you have suggestions on what we should cover, send me a mail. I'll be more than happy to take up suggestions like that. And for now, all I can do is give you my best wishes for next year. Happy New Year. Have lots of fun with your family, or however you will make a party out of this end of year. And I'll see you all back next year.